Yo guys, so this is the Samsung S21 FE 5G. This phone is likely to be really popular this year, so I'm here with a comparison you definitely didn't ask for, but didn't know that you need. And that's a comparison with this camera. This is my Canon C70. This is the professional camera that I use for all of my client videography, filmmaking work. And this whole setup, if you add up all of this kit, is probably going to run you close to $10,000. Now, obviously you would never normally film something that would require a big camera like the Canon C70 on a little camera like the Samsung FE, but at the same time I think these comparisons are super fun to see quite how good smartphone cameras are, and you guys seem to really enjoy them, so that's why we're doing it.
Okay, so first up here, I bet most of you can probably spot that this, yes, is the Samsung S21 FE. This is the main 26mm lens, and first off the bat, the camera does do a really good job with the lighting. Sunset shots just kind of look pretty awesome, in my opinion, on phones a lot of the time. So let's switch over to the Canon here. This shot was actually filmed in 4K 50 frames a second, and then 4K 60 frames a second on the phone. The phone does film at 60 frames a second, but only on that main 26mm lens. And then I've slowed these both down to a 25 frames per second timeline. So first of all, the biggest difference for me between these two shots is the sharpness. They are quite different. There's a ton of digital sharpness in the S21 FE, which is just so popular or so often used in smartphone cameras. And you can see on the more expensive camera system, it's just nowhere near as sharp. If we crop in, play around a little bit here, you can see the difference. We can also add some sharpness to the Canon shot super quickly, and you can actually see how much that does to sort of liken it to the Samsung shot. I definitely prefer it without. Another thing is actually the noise. Maybe it's just my experience with the Google Pixel 6, and maybe also because the FE isn't quite a flagship device, but this is quite a noisy shot on the phone, and it's not like it was actually super dark here. If we compare again side by side, you will see a significant difference in the amount of noise.
One of the advantages of shooting with these more expensive cameras is that they allow you to shoot in profiles or formats with an absolute ton of data within the shot. Smartphones just really aren't designed like that. These are designed to look great out of the box, and this footage from the Canon C70 is designed to be played around with in post. So taking a shot like this, you can see that this is in a log format called Canon or C-Log2. And this is basically what it looks like without any color grading or tweaking. And definitely off the bat, you can say that the phone looks significantly better here. But if we add some contrast to it and we add some saturation to it, that is now starting to look actually really good. The whole point of this is that we can tweak it to really look the way we want it to look. A lot of that work is kind of already done on the Samsung. It's actually quite difficult to undo it. It's much easier to process than unprocess. So the Samsung 21 FE has three lenses. There is a 13mm ultrawide, a standard 26mm, that is the main camera on the phone, and there is also a 76mm telephoto lens. To be honest, I was actually kind of disappointed with the performance of the telephoto lens on the Samsung. I felt like the stabilisation wasn't fantastic. The low light performance was actually really poor on this lens. You can see by this direct comparison, like the detail and the noise were just kind of not great with this lens. It was a bit of a disappointment. I was really excited to try out this 76mm lens, but unfortunately just didn't really feel like this one was totally up to scratch and performed much better on the Canon C70. The wide, on the other hand, and this is a significant win for the Samsung, is it's actually very difficult to get a wide enough shot like this on the Canon C70. This camera shoots with something called a 35mm sensor. So what that essentially means is there's a bit of a crop on the picture, and that does mean that an ultra wide shot like this is very challenging to get on the C70 without a very wide lens and also additional adapters. Whereas on the Samsung, you can just get a shot like this straight away with the ultra wide camera, and I actually think the ultra wide is really good. Here's the widest I could get with a 24mm lens on the Canon C70, but I would have to probably look at getting something like an 8mm to get a comparable shot on this 35mm sensor.
Let's take another look at these two shots here again, because I think it's a really good example of how impressive the dynamic range is on the S21 FE. Basically, these phones are doing an absolute ton of AI processing of different shots, taking shots at multiple exposures. And what that does mean is that these phones are relatively comparable in terms of dynamic range. In terms of the shot here, you can see that the shot is much more even even on the C70, but there is definitely probably more data in the shot from the S21. Because these sensor sizes on the phones are really small, they just shouldn't be able to get results like this, so praise the Lord for computational power. So I wanted to obviously test these slow motion capabilities on the Samsung, and the C70 is a bit of a slow motion beast. It records in a beautiful 120 frames per second, and most importantly, there is no drop in quality of footage from the standard video to the slow motion video on the C70, which is a really important factor for a professional camera. The Samsung are actually a bit slower than this in terms of the actual slow motion capability. It shoots 240 frames per second, but it only does so at 1080p video, which is relatively understandable for a phone like this. I do actually think the slow motion was very good on the Samsung. I think it holds up decently well, and the fact that it is 240 frames a second means that it's really good. This is my friend's dog Myrtle showing off the slow motion capability. There is definitely a significant gap here between the two, but again, one costs a significant amount more. This one really does separate these two devices. So we come back to a lot of the advantage of using a bigger, more pro camera is mostly about control, and a massive advantage is obviously being able to change the look and feel of your shot by swapping lenses on the Canon. So here is a wide portrait shot, and right now you can see the two shots side by side. There's not a gazillion differences between the two cameras here, but if we swap this lens over and change to something a little bit longer with a shallower depth of field, you can see the difference is almost immediate, and this is super obvious which is the more expensive camera. Something that Samsung does have up its sleeve though is it lets us replicate this a little bit using something called portrait mode video. But this obviously isn't perfect and can very easily be picked apart, but it does do a relatively good job sort of replicating the look that you can get out of a more professional camera with a lens, and it does allow for a nice shallow depth of field look in the background. Still, the giveaway is always going to be around the edges here. It's definitely nothing close to the real thing, but again, this is a strong option if you don't have access to a bigger camera. As the last point in this video, let's talk about something where Samsung actually destroys the Canon, and that is stabilization. With bigger cameras, there's certain things you kind of have to avoid. Some people are really good at it, but often if you're shooting handheld, you kind of want to avoid taking too many steps, one after the other. Tracking shots are pretty difficult to pull off handheld, which is why we have things like gimbals. Here's my best attempt at walking in a straight line, not moving the camera on the C70, and it's definitely pretty janky. You can pretty much see each individual step, and I had stabilization turned on the camera here. And with the Samsung, it is noticeably different, a lot more stable. It's definitely not the best stabilization I've ever seen on a phone, but it is still really good. If we actually add some post-stabilization to this as well, you're getting pretty close to the look that you might get out of a gimbal, and that really is pretty impressive. Obviously, this was a very filmmaking, video-centric video on the Samsung FE 5G. If you're more into photography or mobile photography in general, I actually just did a full review of the Pixel 6, and that video can be accessed on screen. I'll see you next time.